since 1 point something. I don't remember which one. It's been a while. I work for Rackspace / Object Rocket. And yes, they actually do call me the mad scientist at work. That's kind of my title now. And that's because I'm one of those people that like to take something and break it down and figure out where it breaks and what kind of really weird things you can do with it. You know, find its limits, push its boundaries, and come up with crazy things that maybe you shouldn't be doing with it, but you could do it. Because for me... No. Okay. Are you talking about adding JSON support into Redis?
Yeah, or faking it.
That's him.
Aha!
Meep, meep.
Yeah. You'd be very disappointed, let me just say that. When I was investigating Redis using Redis instead of, say, Postgres. Yeah. I know.
Did you get the license plate of the bus I just drove over you, Matt? Because no, so Matt is deeper into he's more into the source code of Redis. I'm more the higher level operational, doing tools with it. One of my recent things I've been getting into is the Go programming language. For those of you programmers that haven't used it, use it. It's awesome. I've been programming Python for 20 years, and Go is the first language I've actually been excited about since Python. So, however, when I went out there, I found that there weren't any really good Redis client libraries for it. So I found the best one I could find that was closest to what I wanted, and I forked it. I call it libredis, and it's going beyond just connecting to and talking to Redis. I'm actually adding in higher level features to it. Some management stuff, inspection, auditing, that kind of stuff. So that's kind of that and the use cases of Redis, how to do weird things with Redis. Right now, because I'm at Rackspace, I'm currently very focused on using Redis in a very large scale. By that, I don't necessarily mean, well, I've got 3 terabytes of data I want to put in Redis. I mean, I've got 15,000 instances of Redis I want to run. And it really just kind of changes what you think about Redis in a good way when you're dealing with things at that scale, that type of setup. But it also exposes some things, and I'll introduce you to some of those tonight. So I'm just going to give you first an overview, kind of a review for those of you that are familiar with Sentinel. And then I'll move into some different things you can do with Sentinel, including how to use Sentinel dynamically. I'll get into a little bit of what the client has to do to properly support Sentinel, and what you might have to do depending upon the library you're using. And give you some operational perspectives. Like I mentioned, you run 15,000 of these things, you kind of learn a few things about it. And then I'll introduce you to a tool I've written called Red Skull. So real quick, Sentinel is a way to manage availability and failover for Redis. It is built into Redis in the sense that when you build Redis, it builds Redis CLI, Redis Server, Redis Benchmark. Redis Sentinel is actually an option to the way Redis Server works. So it's all the same code base, which is really nice for a lot of things. And that's why you manage your nodes into a pod, which are your masters, your slaves. Some of the things you can do is for certain events, you can configure it to call scripts when those events fire. It also publishes to Redis's PubSub channel. It actually has a bunch of channels for different types of events that allow you to do better integration, and uses quorum-based selection and promotion system for when a master goes down. And that has some ramifications. So I often hear that phrase. People find out who I am and what I do. It's really surprising how many people go, oh, so I have this Redis cluster. And so the first thing that pops in my mind is, okay, what do you mean? Because those of us following Redis, we know that Redis cluster isn't out yet. And usually it means people say, well, I've got a master and I've got some slaves to it. And if you do a lot in the high availability field, that's not a cluster. And when most people say a Redis cluster, that's what's available, so that's what they're calling it. But that kind of provides some confusion, especially when Redis cluster, which is getting really close to being fully baked, or at least releasable, that's going to be changing what that means. And so I kind of had to come up with some of my own terminology, and I'll use that throughout here. I call it a Redis pod. A pod is what I call a master with one or more Sentinels, or technically 0. And so that covers that. So you got your cluster and you got your pod. A constellation is a group of Sentinel instances which manage one or more pods. And more specifically, constellation is a little bit context sensitive. If you're talking in general like I am now, you can just think of it as the Sentinel instances of managing your Redis pods. You have any number of them, and Sentinels can overlap. One of the first things a lot of people don't realize about Sentinel is one group of, say, 3 Sentinels or 5 Sentinels can manage more than one Redis pod. It doesn't have to be a one-to-one mapping. And they don't all have to be monitoring the exact same pods. They can be different. And that's why Sentinels can overlap. For those who haven't gone into the communication between it very much, on the client side, because Sentinel sits above Redis in a sense and manage that failover, you have to communicate with it a little bit differently. So the client, to use it, what I call proper support, what your client does, instead of giving your client the connection string to your Redis master, you give it the connection string to your Sentinel instances. And it will then issue the command. Let's say you name that one of your pods foo. Then it will connect, it needs to connect and say Sentinel master foo, and then Sentinel will reply with, here's the connection information for the master right now. And then the client gets that IP and port back and then talks to the master directly. So Sentinel's there to coordinate who you need to talk to, who the current master is. Yes?
How is that different from a load balancer?
So with a load balancer, you wouldn't have any of this. You would be, unless you load balance your Sentinels, which you could do. But the difference here is the client is talking directly to the master. Now, conceivably, there's no reason that master couldn't live behind a load balancer. And it's actually one of the ways I recommend it. But if you're going to do that, then you kind of have some little niggly bits. All software has niggly bits, as I like to call it. Things that aren't quite there yet. Redis and Sentinel supporting different IPs from where they actually are running is one of those things that's a little bit in flux right now. It's getting better. So Sentinel is primarily intended to manage your failover. If the master goes down, it will pick a slave that it can promote that slave. If the master comes back up, it will reconfigure the master to be a slave now. So it takes care of that for you. But there are some other things you can do with it. You can use it for monitoring your Redis instances. It's one of those things that comes into play once you start having more than 1 or 2. Because Sentinel becomes that information base. It gives you that opportunity to connect. And Sentinel's already monitoring your Redis instances. So by monitoring them through Redis, or through Sentinel, you're not having to add additional connections and load to your Redis instances. Because you're just pulling that information out of Sentinel. Another really great use of Sentinel is the service discovery. Mentioned earlier, when you manage a pod, you tell Sentinel, I want you to manage this master. You have to give it a unique name. Because you can connect to Sentinel and say, show me all of the pods you're managing. Now you have service discovery. You can connect, let's say you have 4 instances, 4 setups. One's for your web cache, another is for object cache in PHP, another one stores your sessions, and the final one stores your shopping cart transient data. Well, instead of your app hard coding an IP, you can instead have your app talk to a Sentinel box and say, hey, give me the information for pod web cache. And that way it's dynamic. So you're not hard coding your configuration. So that's a really great use I really like about Sentinel. And then something that's coming is information aggregation. Anybody here familiar with the info command in Redis? One of the things that Salvatore has talked about adding in since Developer Day about a month or so ago, recently, Sentinel's already pulling info command from all your Redis instances. So it makes sense that Sentinel will be adding the ability for you to ask Sentinel for that information rather than having to connect and do that again. So just kind of minimize the resource use, plus it'll make it easier for doing informational discovery as well as monitoring. Yeah, so you're not having to go to everything to do it. So that's something that's pretty neat that's coming to Sentinel. So when you're using it for monitoring, Most of the people, if you're monitoring your Redis instance, you're connecting to it, maybe you're running the info, looking at how much memory you're using, comparing that to how much you have available. You're checking if it's up. Maybe you're doing Redis ping. There's some additional things that Sentinel gives you the ability to find out about your overall environment that just talking to a Redis instance won't get you. If you connect to a Redis instance once a minute, or even let's just say every 30 seconds, what if it's temporarily down in between those pulls? You have no idea of knowing that. No way to do that. Sentinel will actually tell you. Sentinel has what's called S-down events. It's a subjective down. When a master goes down, then it issues an S down. And basically that's one of the Sentinel boxes saying, I think the master's dead. And then he asks the other Sentinels, do you think he's dead? And if enough of them agree, if quorum is reached, that's when a failover happens. But depending upon your network, and if you're not doing it on your own, you don't have control over the switches and the entire network layout, you don't know what that network's really doing. For all you know, that network might be going up and down a little bit. If it temporarily goes off for one of your nodes, you'll get an S-down event that will never result in a promotion because the other two nodes are going, no, he's fine. Nothing wrong there. But if you monitor those via PubSub in Sentinel and track those, you can actually get a picture of how stable your network is in between each of those nodes. Maybe you have one node, maybe he's got a network card that's a little bit on the iffy side. And if he's doing that, he's issuing S down, saying, hey, I think the master's down. And the other two are going, no, he's fine. He goes, oh, yep, you're right, he's back up. So by tracking those type of events, instead of just tracking the failover, you can start to get a little insight into the rest of your Redis environment, if you will. And if you're not hosting it, you often don't have access to hosting provider switches. So that'll give you a bit of network insight. Or if you've got system load can spike up for random reasons. Maybe you've got a hard disk that's starting to fail, and so the system's getting a little bit behind. That can produce situations where a master will fluctuate because Redis Sentinel does a Redis ping, and if he gets a ping, if it doesn't get the ping back, issue a subjective down. If that's just happening once every few seconds, then you're not going to catch that unless you just happen to connect at just the right moment, and that almost never happens, right? So that can give you more insight into your system. And if you've got a big BG save, a big background save going on, when Redis does the fsync on the file, that's where you'll see latency spikes if they're going to happen. If your settings are sensitive enough that you'll catch that, or one that's recently come up on the list is a flush all. Got a million keys in there and you do a flush all. It's going to take a few seconds sometimes to flush all that data. And depending on your Sentinel failover settings, doing that can cause Sentinel to go, oh, the master's not responding. So by tracking those subjective downs, again, that gives you more insight into the system without additional monitoring load on your Redis instances. So that's why I think Sentinel makes a great tool to add in for monitoring. Another thing you can do, in my opinion, things like, is the configuration of my setup correct? Is it what I think it's supposed to be? For me, monitoring that particular bit is really important. Especially if you're not the only one on the team that's managing this, maybe you're 24/7, you're distributed around the globe, somebody new comes on, they don't quite know what they're doing, or they think they know what they're doing. That phrase, a little bit of knowledge is dangerous. A lot of knowledge corrects that problem. Somebody gets on there, thinks they know what they're doing, and let's say they remove the monitor from one of your 3 Sentinels. So now you've got a Sentinel that only has 2 monitors. Sentinel's not going to complain about that. Quorum of 2, by default, he's got 2 Sentinels, he can do a failover. But there's nothing that will tell you, hey, somebody deleted the monitor from one of your Sentinels. So by tracking that, you'll get, you can ask Sentinel, how many Sentinels does this guy have? Does this pod have? By tracking that periodically, you can actually catch those events long before they become an issue. So you can do that. You can track epoch changes. An epoch change is somebody changed the configuration of Redis. Maybe the change was good, maybe it was not. Maybe you intended to do it. If you didn't intend any changes in your epoch changes, somebody has changed your Redis configuration. You might want to know that. I'd want to know that. So by monitoring that there, you can pick up on that. Slave changes. As we all know, Redis's authentication mechanism is not exactly super strong. You've got one authentication password, that's it. keys to the kingdom, and it goes plain text over the wire. So let's just say hypothetically somebody gets onto your network, they're sniffing, they see the Redis traffic. Oh look, here's the password. Well, maybe they know that if they actually try to do queries against it, they might get detected. So let's say I just spin up another slave and say, okay, spin up my own Redis instance, connect to that master, now I'm getting a copy of all your data. If you're not looking for that, you'll never know. Redis won't go, oh wait, somebody added a slave. Sentinel will. So by checking for additional slaves, you can also do that. And in my mind, that's something you do as part of monitoring. It's not just, for me, monitoring isn't just, is my system up and responding? It's, is it correct? Is it accurate? Is it the way I've set it up? And if you read the Sentinel documentation, it goes through about how to write the config file. Config file is real simple. It's basically a translation, almost direct one-to-one translation of the commands. Sentinel has an API. You use it just like you do Redis. You can Redis CLI, connect to your Sentinel, by default port 26379, and then you can issue commands. So you can add or remove a pod right there from the command line. And when you do that, Sentinel will then rewrite the configuration file for you. So you don't have to worry about messing up the syntax. You mess up the syntax in the CLI, it just says, nope, that's a syntax error, and you're fine. So, yes?
So, what's the nature of the configuration you can actually do just using it?
So you can do almost, actually I think you can do everything in the API. You can add a monitor, add a monitor's the command to do it. You can add one, you can remove it, you can change passwords?
No, switch masters.
Switch masters, yes, you can do a failover. You can do a forced failover. Interesting thing about that is even if you have only one Sentinel and say your quorum is sent to 10, if you tell Sentinel to do a failover, as long as it has a slave it can promote, it will do it. It doesn't need quorum as long as you tell it. But you can change the settings, like how long do you want to consider it down, before, a non-responding master, how long do you want it to be non-responding before you consider it down? You can set it down to like 1 second. Only do that if you don't like to sleep. The lowest I would go is 3 seconds, and even that can sometimes be a little dicey. You can get the current master, you can also get the list of slaves. Maybe, now with Redis, for those of you that have been using it at high load, you know that you really don't have to do, well, I'm going to do all my reads on the slaves. You can do that. You usually really don't have to because Redis is fast enough to handle that. But you can, if you were writing your app to do that, you could do that. Of course, you have to have connectivity to those slaves. But you can pull that information. You can also get the list of other Sentinels that Sentinel knows about. So with that, you can actually, through the Redis CLI, do it by hand if you want, you could crawl your entire Redis setup and discover everything that's talking to Sentinels. Because if one Sentinel knows about another, who knows about another, they all three know about each other. You only need to connect to one to learn about all of them. And that's where it can be really useful for configuration management. Anybody here use Puppet or Chef or even SaltStack?
Ansible.
Ansible, awesome. Python guy, so yeah, I kind of prefer those. So those, you can push out your Redis config file. I mentioned earlier that when you add a monitor, Sentinel rewrites the config file. So what do you think Puppet or Chef will do on their next run? They're going to change it back, and your information is going to be gone. So advice number one on that, don't manage the config file with those configuration managers. This is not the type of thing that they're set up to do. Because you write that new config file comes in, it's probably going to have the bare minimum, your IP to bind to, the port you're going to bind on, and that's going to be it. Unless you do all of your information in there, and even then, you're still going to lose data because there's additional things that Sentinel writes the config file that aren't part of adding a monitor. It does some state tracking into it. So you never want to, unless you turn off Sentinel, you don't want to mess with a Sentinel config file directly. Just either go through the API or bring Sentinel down, make your changes, and bring it back up. However, because you can use this API from pretty much any language, you can do it from Ruby, you can do it from Python, you can do it from Bash if you want to. You can use the Redis CLI tool. Rather than manage your config file, have your configuration management engine talk to Sentinel directly. So you could still use Puppet or Chef or Ansible or Salt to keep track of all that information. Just have it talk to the API instead of over the config file. So that's another neat thing that being able to do this all through the Redis protocol allows you to do. Because it gets ugly when you start overwriting your config file. It's not a happy day. Now, I mentioned earlier that in order to use Sentinel, you have to know your client has to be able to talk to Sentinel. And so these are basically the requirements. There's two ways you can go about it. And depending on which library you're using, they have varying levels of support for Sentinel. It is the Redis protocol. So anything that actually allows you to send a raw command, in Python, I think it's execute is the command. In a lot of the Go libraries, it's do. It's like do this command. You pass any command you want. So technically, any library that allows you to do that, you can interact with Sentinel. Doesn't mean you have to parse the responses yourself, but you can do it. The other options for libraries that have it is a client which implements the Sentinel command, so it understands the data type that Sentinel is going to give back for the various types of Sentinel commands, like master, Sentinels, that type of information. There are libraries that only support that. We implemented the command, it's up to you to actually implement connection management and how to connect. And then there's option two is a few libraries have what I refer to as full or native support, which means you say, here's my Sentinel IP information, take care of it for me. Obviously, those are the ones you generally want to use. But if you're using a library that doesn't have that yet, you can fall back to the Sentinel command, and if they don't have that, but they have the raw command option, you can do it that way. That also means that your applications then have to be able to talk to both the Sentinel and the Redis nodes. And it's going to sound obvious when I say it, but you'd be surprised how many people don't think about this. Your Sentinel nodes have to be able to talk to every one of your Redis nodes. Not just the master, but also the slaves. You'd be surprised how many people will set that up and not have network connectivity between them. So I mentioned earlier Sentinel has pub/sub for events. Things like subjective down, objective down, master change. There's a new Sentinel. There's a new slave. Those types of things. There's a nice long list of them. Each one of those events goes to its own pub/sub channel. So if all you're interested in is subjective downs and you're wanting to plot those, you just subscribe to the +S down channel. There's also a -S down and a -O down and +O down, which, +S down means, hey, this is now subjectively down, minus means it's not. So you can even listen to just one of them if that's all you're concerned with. That is, in my opinion, the proper way to integrate Sentinel with your monitoring or other management systems is by monitoring these events. A few of them, like master change, that event is one that you can script. You can, in the config file, you can say execute this script whenever this event happens. And then that event has information about it. It's like a master change. Here's the old IP port, here's the new IP port. But doing it through this interface, in my opinion, is a lot better. Plus, you can make that a daemon, so you can monitor your monitoring. There's few things as bad as having the old cron job that fires off and makes this check once a minute or once every 5 minutes and doesn't have any way of getting this information. If you're going to go this route, you have to write a daemon. Something's going to be running all the time, listening for those events. So that's a little bit more work, but it really pays off because you're going to catch them the very instant that they happen. They're going to be published, and because it's Redis pub/sub, you're going to get it immediately. If it goes down in between, if you're trying to do a polling-based system, you can miss it. This will tell you immediately. So you use those to react and record. You can turn those into a log file, real simple one, just if you want to track it all to be able to look back later. You can plot them into a database. You can even talk to another Redis and store those events in there. So the event handling gives you a big way of getting insight into what's going on. It even does things like, okay, I've rewritten the configuration for that slave. Or the master's come up, I've rewritten that configuration. So you can catch a great amount of detail in there. Whoops. This is where the auditing configuration comes into play. Some things that a lot of people don't ask themselves when they set up Sentinel. When you go through the docs, it tells you need to have a quorum. Usually that's 50% plus 1, right? So you want to have an odd number. Minimum Sentinel nodes you want to run if you're managing failover. is 3. Technically, Redis will allow you to do it with 1. It will allow you to do it with 2. You don't want to do this if you're managing failover. And I say that because I mentioned earlier you can use it for service discovery. Maybe you're not running master slaves, but you have a bunch of monitors. You know, you just want to use it as monitoring and service discovery. You can get away with 1. That's just fine. If you're doing failover, you want to have 3, because what will happen, what can happen, is let's say you've got this server, Redis server over here, and this Redis server over here. You've got your Sentinel over here and your Sentinel over here, and you're only running 2. If these guys suddenly become, the switch flakes out and they can't talk to each other, now you have what's called split brain. Both sides think they are the only people around. So now you have 2 masters. When the network gets fixed, which data do you want to keep? You have no way of determining that. So that's why you go with the odd number. That way it takes 2 out of the 3 servers to decide who to promote, if somebody's down, and promote it. But do you have enough Sentinels to form a quorum? Sentinel will allow you to have that situation, because when you make changes to Sentinel, so you've got your 3 Sentinel servers, you have to tell each one specifically, add this guy. If you miss one, say you have a script that brings these up for you, if one of those Redis instances at that moment isn't available and you don't catch that in your script, now you've only got 2 out of your 3 Sentinels monitoring it. If you lose one of those Sentinels, now you can't do failover. Because of that nature, there's no way for Sentinel to tell you, hey, I've got a problem here. But by connecting to it and saying, how many, give me the list of Sentinels for this pod. And then comparing, and the quorum. So you say, I have a quorum of 2, give me the list of Sentinels. There are 2 other Sentinels from this one, I'm good to go. So you do that through there. Do you have too many? Sounds like a strange situation, but I have seen it. New guy comes on, or somebody who's 3 o'clock in the morning. I don't know about you, but alerts at 3 o'clock in the morning, I'm not at my best. I've made mistakes. Somebody thinks the Sentinel's down, so they spin up a new one to replace it. Or somebody typos something, and they add it to a different bank of Sentinels. Maybe you've got multiple constellations, because you've got different levels of availability. And let's say a pod accidentally gets added to the second bank. Now for that pod, and only that pod, he now knows about 6 Sentinels. He has a quorum of 2. Now you're back to the possibility for split brain. Sentinel does not have a way to detect that. It doesn't, software's not quite good enough where it can think what you meant and go, oh, sorry, you didn't really mean to add this second bank of Sentinels. But by monitoring it through Sentinel, connecting, saying, okay, I'm supposed to have quorum plus 1 servers, it can go, oh, I have 6, I'm supposed to have 3. And then you could raise an alert and say, okay, somebody did something wrong, something happened. Do all your masters have slaves? This can happen really, really easily if you're running a single master and a single slave. Master goes down, Sentinel handles the failover for you, you're not aware of it. Until you bring a new slave back up online, whether it's the original master or a new one, Sentinel can't do failover. He's got nobody to go to. Sentinel will not alert on that. That's not what it's made for. But by monitoring that situation, you can get the list of slaves through Sentinel for every pod, every master. So you talk to it, you get that list. Maybe that slave is up, but is configured to not be promotable. There's an option in Sentinel that you can say, or in Redis to say, I want you to be a slave to this guy, but you're not promotable as a master. Maybe he's running on a lower box. Maybe that's a reporting one you just want to have all the data shipped off to run all your reports against. You never want this guy to be promoted. You set that value to 0. You can pull that information out of Sentinel, which means you can have something that runs and goes through the list of all the slaves for a given pod and checks to make sure at least one of them is promotable. And therefore you can catch that situation. I've actually seen a lot of people set up Sentinel, 1 master, 1 slave, it's taken care of, I don't have to worry about it. They don't monitor for the master failing over because everything's automated. 3 days later, the new master fails and they have no slave and now they have no data. So pulling it through there, do they have enough memory is another one. You spin up a slave, you spin up a master. At some point, you increase the available memory on the master and you forget to do about slave. Redis will work just fine until you go to fail over and there's not enough memory on that slave. It'll still fail over, but now you're going to be out of memory and Redis won't be accepting new memory modification commands. And you've just lost a bunch of data probably. So by monitoring that, auditing that configuration, you can also pick that up. So I mentioned looking at it from managing a lot of these. It means you can be a lot more flexible for your configuration. Let's say you're a large enterprise, you've got a bunch of groups within the company that need to use Redis. You could set up a bank of systems and just dynamically change them. Somebody needs one for a few days, you pick one, you assign it to them. After they're done using it, you put it back in the pool. If you're doing everything dynamically through the Sentinel API, you can do that. Much, much simpler than doing it by hand. I mentioned earlier the Chef Puppet thing allows you to integrate with it a lot better than just doing a dumb config file, if you will. Visitor discovery of Redis through the API, that allows you to have something that just crawls through your system. We do this for a lot of things. We have port scans to make sure that a port isn't suddenly listening on a box that's not supposed to be there. You can do the same thing. Sentinel is not authenticated. You can connect to Sentinel, you get all the information there. So let's say I'm on your network, I find you have Sentinel running, I can have you start managing my Sentinels or my Redis instances for me. Maybe that's not what you want to have. Crawling through will let you determine that. And then comparing the discovered configuration to what you've described. This is where it comes down to if you do a lot of PCI or SEC type systems where configuration management includes not just having a system to do it, but making sure that at any given moment, what you have deployed is what you're supposed to have deployed. And of course, that's just good policy overall. But that's one of the things that you can do with Sentinel, makes it a lot easier. Mentioned earlier, everything has niggly bits. This all sounds really good. It is really good. There are some caveats, and here they are, the fine print. I mentioned the first one, use an odd number of Sentinels, half plus 1. Redis will let you set 1 and have 10 Sentinels. That's up to you. It doesn't presume to know more than you. You can do that. There are some who make the case that it shouldn't allow you to do that. Redis is more along the lines of, if you are telling me explicitly to do this, I'm going to trust that you know what you're doing. The aforementioned service discovery is a good reason to keep it. If you're just using it to discover servers, you don't care about quorum. So it will allow you to set that. I mentioned earlier you can get the number of other Sentinels that a pod or Sentinel is aware of. So when you say, give me the list of Sentinels, or one of the info commands is number of other Sentinels, num other Sentinels. That does include itself, just the other ones it's heard about. That number is not live. So I mentioned earlier the case of somebody adding an additional Sentinel. If they add that and then you turn that Sentinel down, that number will still indicate, in that example, 4. So you can't fully trust that number yet. That's something that's on the table to be fixed. But right now, it's more of a high watermark. It's the maximum number of Sentinels I have seen. Now you might be thinking, okay, that's really not a big deal. However, as of 2.8.14 or 15, a bug was discovered in there. So there's the quorum I've talked about, the number of Sentinels that have to agree that a server is down. There's actually a hidden quorum that really isn't that obvious. And that is the number of Sentinels that have to be casting a vote. So if you have a quorum, if you have 10 total Sentinels that Sentinel is known about, and you have a quorum of 3, then the minimum number of Sentinels to cast a vote is not 3. It's 6. So if you had a Sentinel quorum, a Sentinel bank of 5, and somebody added an additional 5 somehow, and those 5 are not actually there, you cannot fail over because you cannot reach the number of votes required to achieve quorum. The Sentinel boxes can say, hey, this guy's down, but that hidden quorum is they have to elect somebody amongst themselves to actually make the configuration change. One of them has to step up and say, yep, I'll do this. I'll take one for the team and decide to do this and tell who to promote. That's what that hidden quorum is for. So that's why that number you want to keep track of and make sure it's accurate. Because you can still wind up in a situation where you've got enough Sentinels for a quorum that you know about, but none of them will have the guts to say, okay, I will actually do this for you. The same thing with sentinels. So the command to get the list of sentinels for a given master is sentinel sentinels master. That list of sentinels you get back has the exact same problem for the same underlying reasons. In the future, that's changing, but for right now, you have to reset that pod to clear that out. And it's a sentinel reset, the name of that pod. What reset does is it removes all the list of known sentinels on that sentinel and all the slaves, and then it rediscovers them. And you have to do that, again, on every single sentinel. And it can get a little bit tricky at that point in coordinating, because, as you can imagine, if a sentinel doesn't know about the other sentinels, he's not going to be able to do a failover, and vice versa. So if you monitor it, and you should, you want to pull that and then talk to each sentinel in that list to verify that he's actually there. Go to each of the sentinels in the list and say, give me the master for this pod. If it goes, you've got a problem. So verify it and validate it. Again, sentinels must be able to talk to each other. That's another thing I've seen. We set up Sentinel, they can talk to the Redis instances, it makes sense, and we don't realize they actually have to talk to each other as well. There is one time that they talk to each other, and that's when they think a master is down. The absolute most critical point in the system, they have to be able to talk to each other. Otherwise, they all talk to each other through the master. So make sure that they can connect to each other. Mentioned earlier, Sentinel is unauthenticated. So protect your Sentinel. Don't just stick it out there. Use network ACLs. Keep anybody and everybody from being able to get to it. You only want to be able to have your admin or monitoring boxes reach it, as well as your, well, actually that's it. Because Redis servers don't talk to Sentinel, they are talked to by Sentinel. So they don't have to have connectivity back. So you want to do that. In the future, that's going to change. It's not going to be soon, because that is a little bit more complicated. I actually submitted a pull request for doing that. And as Matt helpfully pointed out, there's a lot additional things that have to go on. Which, a side note, Sentinel uses the same configuration parser as Redis, because it's the same code. If you have require pass in there, you cannot use that Sentinel, because Sentinel will say, oh, I have to have this password before I'll let you do anything. But it does not support the auth command. So it's like saying, you have to have a key to open this door, but I'm not going to put a lock on it so that you can actually put the key in. So be careful about that. And the monitor and Sentinel remove has to be done on every Sentinel. They don't communicate between them. So all that sounds great. Great way to monitor Redis, great way to find out information that's going on. And that's some interesting terminology. A lot of things, Redis is getting a little bit more complicated now. One of the beautiful things about Redis is it's really simple. We start throwing Sentinel into it, and like anything that gets distributed, now it's not so simple. And oh yes, I have to make changes on everything whenever I do it. And I know some of you are thinking, I don't want to deal with that. Neither do I. I did it, I didn't like it, and as a result, you don't actually have to. I've written what's called the Red Skull. Any Captain America fans in here? That's the reference.
Red Skull's a bad guy.
Yes, he is. But
why'd you name it after a bad guy?
because he likes to maintain a fascist control over his troops. And when it comes to distributed systems, that's what you want. Just like with Sentinel. If you have a slave on a pod and you decide, oh, I'm going to repurpose that slave to put him on a different, I'm going to promote him to a new master and he's going to run another instance for me, guess what's going to happen? Sentinel's going to see him come up on that same IP and port, and he's going, you're supposed to be a slave. And he's going to fix it. Which is why that Sentinel reset command comes in handy. So that's why. And it's a little difficult finding things with the word red in them anymore for project names. So what does it do? It manages a cluster of Sentinels. Sentinel by itself is a single node. It knows about other nodes, but it doesn't really, other than doing an S down election, doesn't really interact with them. Red Skull will manage that group of sentinels. And it provides an API so you can call a Red Skull and say, add this pod, monitor this guy for me. Red Skull will go and do all the nitty gritty for you. You say, I want a quorum of 3. It will go, all right, out of my cluster of sentinels, I will pick 4, quorum plus 1, and assign them to the 4 least used sentinels. Say you have a bank of 10, and in that case, it will pick the 4 sentinels that have the least number of pods they're managing. Real basic load balancing, right? Not terribly complicated, nice and simple, easy to understand. But that means you don't have to pick them, do all that yourself, and then go issue commands to every single one of them. It also works for taking it down, doing a failover, handles all that for you. It does that auditing I've been talking about. It will actually go through and say, does this slave have enough? Does this pod have a promotable master? Is there enough quorum? Is my constellation in balance? Do I have too many sentinels? Do I have not enough sentinels? And it can correct some of those for you. It will not do it automatically, but it has a web interface that you can look at and say, oh, too many sentinels. It'll have a button. You click the button and it will fix that for you. Or you don't have enough sentinels. It will fix that for you, assuming you have enough sentinels to meet your requirement, which is another thing that it will do. If you go through the Red Skull API and say, I need a quorum of 8, and it has 3 sentinels, it will go, I'm not going to do that. I cannot achieve quorum. This is not a configuration I can let you do. Of course, you can go and do it by hand, but why would you? And provides a window into that cluster via the web-based interface. You can see the constellation. You can drill all the way down into individual nodes. I do have some screenshots in here. This is the dashboard view. So this is a nice little Go app. It's really simple to deploy. It's one binary and an HTML directory. That's it. It's configured entirely by the environment. Anybody familiar with the 12-factor app manifesto? I think it's number 3, configure by environment, not config file. That's what it does. Same defaults. The way you deploy this is you deploy it on your sentinels. Because if you're using authentication on your pods, on your masters, it has to know those. Sentinel will not give up your authentication information for them. You have to tell it when you add it, but it will not tell it to you. Kind of makes sense. So you run it on the Sentinel, and it has to have access to your Sentinel config file, and it will go through there and discover everything about that setup, including the authentication, so it can talk to the instances. This is a dashboard, and it gives you a brief overview of what's going on. In this case, you can see we have 4 Sentinels. There are only 2 pods on there, and one of the pods has a problem. This projector is not displaying red very well. That's red. Yeah, it's red over there, it's not red up here. This text is also red. So, and then down here, so this is a real simple Go web application. The front end, I am not a front end guy. Anybody who wants to help make this look much better, I'm more function first. So if you want to help, this is on GitHub, of course. And then I used Bootstrap for the front end. So if it looks familiar, that's why. This is a set of tabs down here. I've broken out some of the standard problems that Red Skull will detect. No quorum, missing sentinels, too many sentinels, I don't have a valid slave. The last one I haven't quite got nailed down correctly. It doesn't always determine that you don't have authentication to connect to a pod. And then it will list them here. We see I've got web cache main. He does not have a quorum. That's a red thumb pointing down. His master is currently here. He has 0 slave count. You can't really see it too well. And 1 out of 3 sentinels, I think. So that's the dashboard, and that will list them all, and it'll filter down. Constellation view, this is where you get to see the bigger picture. So here we've got 4 sentinels. Yes, they're all running on localhost. They're in the repo for this. There is a dev Red Skull tmux script that will actually fire up Sentinel instances for you, and Redis instances, 9 Redis instances, and I think 4 Sentinels, and run this so you can actually make changes and see what's going on and test it. And so that's what this is showing. It tells you the version, how long that Sentinel's been up, how many pods it's monitoring. And it lists all of them. At some point, if you had 50, this would look really bad. It'll also tell you the overall constellation. This is called balanced. What balanced means is the number of, if you take the number of pods times the number of sentinels they're supposed to have, if the number discovered does not match the number calculated, your constellation is unbalanced. That means somebody somewhere does not have the appropriate setup. That's probably going away. It's from an old iteration of the project. The initial project concept was I would be managing a single group, but then it expanded to where you can pick out of a bank of sentinels, and the concept of balance kind of goes away a little bit. Tells you the total number, or total pod memory, and that's your max memory setting in Redis config. So it goes to all of them, all the pods, and says, okay, how much memory are you allowed to use? How much memory are you allowed to use? And totals it up for you. And then the total node memory, which is, it totals it for every single node, not just on a pod level. Number of nodes managed. Here, I call it an instance size. In this case, I'm managing one 5 meg instance. And again, this is where it comes in handy if you're doing it for multiple groups within the company. In that you can know how much of each group of each size that you're needing to run. You'll notice on the right you can add a pod or add a sentinel. If you bring up a new sentinel, you just hit the button, put in the connection string, and it will add it in. It will go discover everything that it knows about, and then add it to this list. And that's also where you add a pod. So you can go in, it's just real dead simple web form. This is the connection information for the master. Add it, I need a quorum of this, and it'll go off and do it for you. Because I'm a bit lazy in that regard, and I don't want to be doing that all the time, and I make mistakes. It will go through. One of the options, you can list all the nodes. This is your basic bootstrap data table. Live filtering on the search. It'll give you every pod, when was the last time it started, what version it's running, how much memory is used, how much memory is available to be used on that instance. And those click through to the pod view. A lot of people will put up a screenshot of what things look like when they're running perfectly, and I think that's kind of boring. It doesn't really help out. It's like, well. So this one has problems. He cannot fail over. That is supposed to be red, and he is flipping the table. Slave memory status, that's where it checks, does the slave have enough memory to handle the master? It will tell you that right there. We can see that it's complaining about the number of configured sentinels. Configured sentinels is quorum plus 1, is what it's supposed to be. Live sentinels is the number of sentinels that are actually saying, yes, I'm managing that pod right now. Those can be different. One of these can be green and the other one can be red. And then what the current master node is, because it can do the failover for you, you might want to know exactly which one you're talking to. And then memory usage bar and the number of slaves currently attached. Might be why he can't fail over. Oh, he has no quorum either. If we had a connected slave, the information would show up here. Address, port, the name of it. So in Sentinel, the name of a Redis node is its IP and port. IP:port, that's its name. Kind of makes it nice and easy, but it's good to display it. The slave priority, that's the variable I was telling you about earlier. If you set it to 0, that slave cannot be promoted. Red Skull will check for that, and it will actually highlight it in red saying, hey, this guy's not promotable. Slave max memory. Replication offset. That is basically the number that replication is at on the master versus the slave. If you're doing a really high amount of data modification, it may be off a little bit. It shouldn't be off a lot. I have seen it off by 1 or 2 digits very rarely. But that would be something in the future. I want to add checking of that to where you could say, hey, if it's beyond a certain amount offset, I need you to flag this guy and say there's something wrong with him. Maybe his replication's lagging. And then actions such as deleting it. Live sentinels are listed here. So every sentinel that is managing that pod, you can actually see it. Available actions. This right side actually changes a little bit. View master node takes you to the node view. Add slaves. So you can add a slave to a pod right here. Maybe somebody forgot to add the slave when they brought it up by last night at 3 in the morning. You just add it in there. It'll take care of it for you. Slave has to be up. It's not going to provision it yet. That'll be taskmaster coming eventually. Reset slaves and sentinels, that's what I was talking about earlier. If your sentinel count is off, reset it. If your slave count is off, or you're taking a slave out of that guy, you need to do the reset. Eventually those are going to change. This is actually one of the reasons that we're going to be changing that. That problem was really kind of discovered. Rebalance pods. Rebalance pod. If these are green, if he has, in this case, 3 sentinels configured and 3 sentinels reporting, you won't see that button because it won't do you any good. Rebalance, if I were to run rebalance on this, it would go to my list of those 4. It would pick 3 of them with the least amount used and then add them for you. That's what that button would do. And then hopefully disappear. The thing about this, Red Skull is querying this data on every view because Redis is fast enough we can get away with it. So it can reload faster than the data has actually hit and the servers are being monitored. So sometimes it'll go, oh wait, everything's gone red. Give it a moment, reload it, you're usually fine. Right now stop managing doesn't work because it's just a matter of adding it in, but in the early development stage, that's kind of a nuclear button. It removes it from Sentinel, and you really don't want to deploy something like that to production until it's fully ready. So it's just not enabled. And because he can't fail over, you do not get the button to force a manual failover. If he was able to fail over, you'd see a button, you could click it, it would do the failover for you. And that's the pod view. This is just a close-up from the dashboard. This is the bottom half of the dashboard. One of the things I did here, because these aren't exactly standard definitions, I mean, they make sense when you think about them, but if you don't know, this is what you want the ops guy at 3 o'clock in the morning who has to deal with to see, which is, this is the problem, here's why it's a problem, and here's the solution. In this case, the solution is hit the reset button in the pod view, it'll fix it for you, hopefully. And then it shows you, these are the pods that have that particular error. Under all errors, it is all of them. Sometimes, this case I actually have a valid auth, but I haven't quite been able to rule out other reasons. So because Redis doesn't authenticate on the connection, you can have a connection but not be authenticated. So it makes it a little bit, you actually have to issue commands and then hopefully you get the right response to tell you that you don't have proper authentication. I don't have up here the node view. So on the node view, you get to see all the information about memory usage, command stats. You actually get a table that says here's the commands you've been running. If you've looked at the command stats output of info, it's there for you. And one of the things that kind of bit me, I was doing a lot of web-based stuff, a lot of time to first byte. Any web developers deal with time to first byte? Yeah, kind of a big thing. Well, I used to work at Cloud Sites, which is a huge web hosting platform. And time to first byte was one of the things I was particular about. A lot of WordPress. If you do WordPress, you know that it's slow. And it's just what it's doing is what makes it so slow. That time to first byte is really bad. And when I was developing Red Skull, the logs for it output how long it took to generate this page. And my mind was thinking milliseconds. And I was reading like 900. I'm like, why is this? Redis is not slow. I should not be taking 900 milliseconds to run an info command. What is going on here? So about an hour and a half later, I actually paid attention, and it was 900 microseconds. So I spent time trying to optimize back down to where it should be, figuring out what I did wrong. And what I did wrong was just reading it wrong. So on that page, what it will do is it will convert it for you. If it's less than a millisecond, it will say full text microseconds. 623 microseconds, 0.32 microseconds. Once it hits the milliseconds, it will say milliseconds. Because I make mistakes, I try to not make them again. And in this case, not making it again meant spelling the word out. It doesn't yet convert it to seconds. Eventually that will probably happen, but I'm not doing it right now because if you start hitting seconds in your commands, you have a problem. And you should see a big number and it should scare you. Redis, MySQL, any MySQL users here? Slow query. How long is a slow query timeout before MySQL says, hey, this query is taking a long time? Okay, it's measured in seconds, usually 4 seconds. And if you're coming from that background, it's like, oh yeah, you're 4 seconds, that's totally doable. It's measured in milliseconds, in microseconds in Redis, because commands should not take that long. And so that's one of the things about that difference, and why that, knowing that you're dealing with smaller units of time than you're used to, is kind of important. And it will give you all that information about the command stats, put it in a table. Everything that's available in the info command can be there. Nice thing about this, there's a HTTP-based JSON API sitting behind it. It's actually the exact same code. It's just a matter of either displaying HTML or JSON. So you can actually go to Red Skull and do a get and get all the information available in info command on any given Redis node. So, and some additional things that aren't part of info but are calculated from it, like number of sentinels, number of live sentinels. You run an info command, it doesn't tell you how much your max memory is. You have to get that via config command. So Red Skull actually does a config get and will tell you what the max memory is. So all that information is available in both web interface and the back end. It also tells you what type of persistence you're using. So with Redis, you can have snapshots, RDB, you can have AOF, append-only file, and you can have neither of those. So you can just be running it in straight cache. It will tell you which you're doing. So if somebody has accidentally turned off RDB, it will show you. It's not an error because it assumes you know what you're doing, but it will tell you you are running it in cache mode. And if you do have persistence, it will tell you the number of changes right now that have not been written to disk. And because you can pull that via an API, you could include that in your monitoring. So you could actually track, is my save settings, does it match my actual workload? And for me, that's really important to be able to do that. So that's in there as well. The API will also let you do the adding of new monitors, removing, doing failovers. It's all there. One of the things I've added on my list, this is where the mad scientist kind of comes in a little bit. This really isn't all mad scientist-y, but just before the dev day, I was thinking, what if Red Skull pretended to be a sentinel? That would allow you to talk to it like it was a sentinel, which means you could actually have Red Skull managing Red Skulls. Don't do it, but you could. And so one of the things that's going to be added to it is a Sentinel API support. So you could connect to it as if it's Sentinel and say, monitor this guy at this IP, this port, this quorum, set them up, and go away. So if you already have tools doing this, maybe it's your configuration management system. Rather than go to each Sentinel, you could still use that API and eventually talk to Red Skull the exact same way. So that will allow it to integrate into any existing systems you have and any others that people develop. I mentioned earlier, it bootstraps itself from the config file. It's an environment variable. etc redis sentinel.conf is what it expects. It'll listen on port 8000. All environment variables are caps red skull _ whatever the configuration name is. So sentinel config file, all caps Redis or red skull _ sentinel config file. Give it where it is. It'll use it and fire up. A caveat is the minimum Sentinel configuration file you need to actually run Sentinel is 2 words. Port and the port number. That is the bare minimum. If you have that and it's writable by Sentinel, that one will bite you. That's the minimum you need. Red Skull has to be able to identify what Sentinel it's running on. So when it develops that list, it knows when it gets that list of 5 that it's one of them, there are 4 others. So in order to do that, you have to add bind and then the IP that Sentinel is running on. That way, Red Skull can know properly where he's running on. It will try to determine the IP address if it's not there, but because there's so many options in how you can deploy that, it's better to just put it in the config file. So that makes your minimum config file for bootstrapping one, the port and the bind statement, and there you're good to go. It does not currently read multiple bind IPs, but that's the one caveat. You run on every Sentinel. You could put Red Skull behind a load balancer, talk to any Red Skull in there. So it's scalable as much as your Sentinels are. Some of the future features, the Sentinel API I mentioned. I'm using Console and Surf, which is a Raft-based clustering mechanism, to where Red Skull itself will be clustered and can communicate with other Red Skulls. So where that really comes into play is having metadata. So you have this pod. What if you want to track the failovers? Well, Red Skull can't do that because it works on things in real time. And this will allow us to do things like tracking that and having a database within Red Skull, a shared key value store, that will be able to show you the number of failure events or all these types of things that are going on, as well as give you the ability to say, okay, well, this particular pod, its name is web cache, and it runs in this data center, it does this, and add just additional operational information into it. The other catch is, say you've got a bank of 5 Sentinels, you're running quorums of 3, Red Skull's running on Sentinel, on every Sentinel. Say the one running on 5, he's not going to know how to authenticate to Sentinels, to pods he doesn't manage, because Sentinel doesn't pass configuration information. Red Skull will be able to do that. Currently it uses a library called Group Cache. It's not the best, but when you're in a pinch and you need to do something, you find something that works. But it has some issues. The nice thing about Console is it also runs the DNS, and you can use it for service discovery. You can actually query these boxes for DNS. It runs on a non-standard port because it doesn't assume that you want it to run your DNS. You could. You can configure bind to do forwards to it. But you could actually do an SRV record pull against it and get the IP and port for your Red Skull instances. And the nice thing about that is you can define checks. If a Red Skull dies, it will not show up in DNS anymore. So that's just a neat little thing that'll be adding, and then allow us to do a lot more cluster-like communication amongst the system. Taskmaster is a subsystem. If you're familiar with the idea of microservices as an architecture, that's where this is going. I want to be able to put in here the ability to call various provider APIs. So you'd be able to say, well, I need a pod that has this much memory and this number of slaves, this quorum, and maybe it figures it out for you. And it would actually talk to your provider and deploy those instances for you and then add them into your Sentinel Red Skull setup. So that's one of the things that'll be coming. I actually have the code to do the next 2 pieces. I want to make sure it's a little more sensible. The ability to clone. So you could say, take this Redis instance and clone it to this one over here. Now yes, you could say slave of this guy, and that will get you the data. It won't get you the configuration settings. It won't get you the slaves that are attached to it. It won't automatically promote it for you. This clone tool actually, I wrote the command line tool that's being integrated that does that. That you can say clone this guy, and optionally, by the way, when you're done cloning it, promote him to a master. And another option says when you do that, go grab all the Sentinels that were talking to the original guy and point them to the new guy. So you could actually do a full migration through Red Skull at some point. And that's where the migrations and clones will be coming in to play. And I am done. Questions?